Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and obviously with free agency and all these different trades and just the crazy NBA offseason that we've seen so far, there's been a lot of teams making big moves and drastically changing their teams. But there's one team that I feel is worth pointing out and worth mentioning and looking at that's doing a fantastic job of rebuilding and building up their team. And it's a franchise we're really not talking a lot about, but has made a lot of moves this offseason. And that's the Memphis Grizzlies. And like I said, it hasn't been the flashiest thing in the world, but if you're looking at a team that, to be honest, is at a complete distinct disadvantage as a franchise, being in Memphis, not really being a big basketball destination, they've done a really good job of positioning themselves to potentially be really good in the future. Because here's a list of some of the things that they've already done this offseason. They obviously made the Mike Conley trade. They moved him to Utah. I'm going to talk about that in detail a little bit later. They drafted Ja Morant. They moved up to select Brandon Clarke, both of which are going to be important pieces of their team. Obviously, Morant more so than Clarke. They re-signed Jonas Valanciunas, who they got in the Marc Gasol trade, to a 3-year, $45 million deal, which is pretty good value for him. And it goes right up until about when he's probably going to start to decline as a player. That's when they're going to get out of the contract. So that's a great idea for them. They traded for the salary of Andre Iguodala in exchange for getting a draft pick from the Warriors so that they could bring in D'Angelo Russell. So they basically get a free pick just by using their cap space. They moved Chandler Parsons for 2 smaller contracts that are potentially going to be more movable down the road in Solomon Hill and then Miles Plumlee as well. Then you've got the fact that they took flyers on Josh Jackson and Anthony Melton in a recent trade where they sent Kyle Korver to the Suns. I don't really know if either of those guys are really going to work out for them, but at least it's giving them more opportunities to have good young players on the roster. And then they ended up trading DeLon Wright in a sign and trade to the Dallas Mavericks for 2 second-round picks. And that's all just this offseason. And obviously, some of those moves are more important than others, but the concept here is more about just always progressing, always moving forward, always working to put yourself and your team in a better position than they were before you made whatever move that you did. And the biggest ones that they made over the past couple of months were trading away franchise cornerstones Mike Conley and Marc Gasol. And it's really interesting now that both of them have been moved, and then some of the pieces they got even in that trade have been moved. It's really interesting to see what they got out of that deal in the long term, at least the combination of those two deals. But basically, they turned those two players, and it's worth noting that their contracts weren't all that great. They were aging players, but they maneuvered and traded them at a time in which they were very valuable to the teams that they moved them to. They turned those two guys into Grayson Allen, Jonas Valanciunas, Jay Crowder, who could be moved later, the ability to move up and select Brandon Clarke in this past draft because they traded for the 23rd pick in the Conley trade and then moved up to 21 by just throwing in a future second-round pick, plus a future first-round pick from the Jazz protected for next year, and then 2 future seconds as well. And on paper, that might not seem like a lot, but really the more you look at it, that's really good value considering the contracts and the age of those two players. And some of that came, by extension because they moved DeLon Wright for those 2 second-round picks, who was originally part of the Gasol trade. They brought back Valanciunas on a deal, who was also originally part of the Gasol trade, and then everything else came out from Mike Conley's trade. But all of those things, this is just smart maneuvering by them because they weren't really going anywhere with this team. They weren't playing especially well with them anyway. They struggled to stay healthy at times. So they moved players that might not have been huge assets. It's not like they're trading, all NBA caliber players at this point in their careers, but they're getting value out of them and they're getting back good value. And as you look at their roster now after they've made all these moves, they've positioned themselves to just be in a really good spot, and they can go in a couple of different directions from here, and they have the flexibility and the talent to be really good within the next couple of years. They've got 2 future stars in Ja Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr. They've got 2 good second contracts veteran guys in Kyle Anderson and Jonas Valanciunas that are just good basketball players that are going to be able to help their team. They've got a handful of younger guys on the roster, some of which I've already mentioned, like Brandon Clarke and Grayson Allen, Josh Jackson, D'Anthony Melton, Dillon Brooks. All these guys have varying degrees of potential. And if you're paying attention to really any of my videos or podcasts, I'm not a huge Josh Jackson guy, but the point is they're at least giving themselves a chance to find some good young players to move forward with this group, kind of on the fringes of the potential young players player pool at least. And then they've got some veterans that are either usable on the court and helpful to their team, or at the very least their contracts are usable and movable in a potential deal, whether it's because they're expiring or just because they're good value contract. And obviously this is an entirely different circumstance, but the more you see kind of the direction the Grizzlies are moving, some of the moves that they're making, how they're maneuvering, it kind of reminds me of the beginning of the Nets' Sean Marks rebuild. Obviously, like I said, it's different circumstances, but they're just making smaller moves. They're positioning themselves to be able to move upwards incrementally, and then hopefully at some point make a big step by, taking on salaries for draft picks from other teams, drafting well in the late first and early second rounds, trying to get value out of every single draft pick that you can, and then just obviously signing players to smart contracts like the Valanciunas one. And the Grizzlies have an advantage even that the Nets didn't have, that they have 2 top 5 picks that look like future stars potentially in the league in Ja Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr. And strangely and somewhat ironically, this also kind of began, or at least in the beginning stages of it, they have some issues with having future first-round pick, or in this case pick, in the Nets case picks, being owed to other teams. Obviously, we know that the Nets went a couple of years without their own first-round pick, or at least the rights to it. They had to get other teams like the Wizards to give them first-round picks in exchange for a variety of deals. But in this case, the Grizzlies owe their first-round pick to the Celtics next year, top 6 protected, then unprotected the year after that. And that stems all the way from a deal that they made back in 2015 for Jeff Green. And that's kind of the one big thing that's holding this team back, and they're trying to find ways to still improve despite that kind of hanging over their head. And it's just another kind of weird, strange similarity from this rebuild to what the Nets just finished doing. And as Brooklyn showed, like, giving away a future first-round pick in what ended up being a really bad trade doesn't have to completely doom your franchise. You just have to be smart about the moves that you make, about the players that you draft. You have to take on salaries from other teams that'll allow you to accumulate even more draft assets that you wouldn't have been able to otherwise, for example, like they did with the Warriors and Andre Iguodala. And they've accumulated a good amount of assets. Like I said, they got an extra first-round pick this year because of the Conley trade. They've got Utah's first-round pick next year. They've got the Warriors' first-round pick next year, obviously with some protections on that. They've got 2 second-round picks from the Mavs. And all of these things are kind of coming together to show a team that just knows what they're doing. And that's so crucial, and that's so important in the modern NBA, because these players, in terms of free agents, whether it's max guys or middle tier guys or whatever, they all talk to each other, and they all understand now more than ever what organizations and what franchises are being run well and run properly and which ones aren't. And it's very clear to me at this point, at least specifically with this offseason and going back to the Marc Gasol trade as well, the Grizzlies know what they're doing. The Grizzlies are moving in the right direction. They're accumulating as many assets as they can. They've got 2 really good young players. If they can keep their pick next year, that would be a bonus, because by 2021, they should be really good. And I wouldn't be surprised to see them make another move either. Like I said, they've got some future first-round picks. They've got movable contracts, expiring contracts. Even guys like Valanciunas and Anderson could potentially be movable depending on what another team would like to give up. So if there's a young player that fits their timeline that becomes disgruntled, the Grizzlies could certainly be players for them. And this is kind of the ideal scenario that I talked about in their What's Next video a couple of weeks ago. It extended to, like I said, hopefully keeping their pick next year and then being really good in 2021. But they've found a way to put other players around Jaren Jackson Jr. and Ja Morant that fit their timeline a little bit better, because prior to all this, really it was basically just DeLon Wright, if they were able to bring him back, and then Dillon Brooks were the only players that really fit this young player timeline. But now they've got some, maybe not tangible, really good NBA players, but at least potential guys like Melton and Jackson and Grayson Allen and Brandon Clark. They're starting to build what some people would call a young core. And like I said, hopefully for their sake at least, they can keep their pick next year and then get really good in 2021. But they're making all the right moves. They're making smart trades on the margins, not just looking at big moves, not just looking at, how their top 5 picks are going to turn out, but all of these other things. Moving up to get Brandon Clark, moving up 2 picks to get him is probably going to end up being a huge thing, because hopefully he ends up playing really well and is a good complementary option to their 2 stars, or hopefully stars at least. And that's really what all this is going to end up revolving around. None of this stuff matters. None of these smart moves really matter if Jaren Jackson Jr. and Ja Morant don't turn out to be really good. But if they do, they've got everything else set up really well. And I'm not saying that the Grizzlies are going to be some big free agency destination like the Nets ended up being this offseason, but at least opens up the possibility to put them in the position similar to what the Mavs have done over the last couple of years, where they've been able to maybe throw a little bit more money at kind of a middle tier guy and have been able to bring in some free agents over the last couple of years, because they're going to have Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr. on the rookie contracts, both for the next 3 years, and then Morant obviously for the next 4 because he just signed his. And they've got all these other immovable contracts, and they could conceivably open up a ton of cap space in either the next 2 summers if they wanted to, if they felt like they were in position to bring in another piece that could really help them. Again, it's probably not going to be a true max caliber guy, but for the Grizzlies at least, and for teams like them in smaller markets that aren't in LA or New York or even in Texas, really, you could make the case in Miami are big free agency destinations and the right circumstances. It's just really, really important that they continue to build like this, and they've done an awesome job of putting themselves in that position, like I said, to potentially make a relatively large leap within the next 2 off seasons. And it all stems from what they did with the Gasol trade at the trade deadline and all of these moves that they're making this off season. And it's been a relatively quiet thing, and something I like to do on this channel is point out some things that maybe other people aren't talking about or aren't paying enough attention to, at least. And I think the Grizzlies and the job that they've done this offseason is one of those things, because, like I said, eventually all these moves are going to come together and hopefully work out in their favor, but at the very least, they're making the correct moves to get out from under what was at one point a pretty bad situation with the big contracts of Gasol and Conley on the books, owing a future pick to the Celtics. They put themselves in a much better position now than they were 6 months ago, and that's something that I think is going unnoticed, but I think their front office should be applauded for at this point. And there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.